Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you look at this. Hi, I am going to go do a lecture 3 exam review, which is on the nervous system. For those of you that aren't going to make it to the lecture in the afternoon, and also for those of you in the morning who we didn't get around to actually doing the review. We finished the whole lecture. So anyway, we're going to go through the nervous system exam review. Just a reminder, it's on Monday. For the morning group, it's at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I will give you ample time to do it. For the afternoon group, it will start like right on schedule with lecture at 12:45. So there won't be a lecture on Monday. And what else? As far as the nervous system lab, I will be sending you information about that as soon as I get it together here. So, all right, let's see. All right. Okay, so where is that? Right there. Okay, so with the nervous system lab, I'm sorry, nervous system lecture exam, basically it was 4 parts. We have the general, we have the brain, we have the spinal cord, and we have the autonomic nervous system. With the general, so this is kind of divided amongst the lectures. The first lecture we spoke about how the nervous system is organized, what makes up the central nervous system, obviously the brain and the spinal cord, peripheral nervous system. We spoke about that, what are the parts of it, the somatic nervous system and the ANS. We spoke about terminology, efferent versus afferent, or sensory versus motor, the differences between those two, which direction they go. So those are some of the terms we learned. We also learned a bit about the structure of a neuron. So what it all boils down to is what's responsible for the nervous system doing what it does. It has to do with neurons. And neurons are the basic functional unit of the nervous system. We discussed the different parts of it. Remember the cell body, the dendrites, the axons, and the axon terminals. You should know what goes on with each area. You know, where the neurotransmitter is secreted, of course, is across the axon terminal. What receives the input is the dendrites, and of course, the action potential is generated at the axon hillock, which is that electrical signal that will go all the way down to the axon terminal. We're able to classify neurons based upon their structure. Remember, we spoke about unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. You should know the features of those. You should know which neurons are which. In other words, multipolar neurons are motor and interneurons, whereas sensory neurons are unipolar, whereas sense organ neurons, like the eyes, the ears, the nose, those are all bipolar. We spoke about the hierarchy of the nerve, basically much like the muscle. Remember, the neuron is wrapped in a layer of connective tissue called the epineurium. Then you've got the underlying fascicles, which are wrapped in perineurium, and so on. Functional classification of neurons, that refers to sensory. Remember, sensory or afferent refers to information coming from the periphery into the central. Motor, obviously, or efferent information or a response from the central nervous system out to the periphery. And then, of course, the interneurons, which comprise the majority of neurons. At the synapse, remember the synapse is the point of communication between 2 neurons or a neuron and another type of cell. And remember, the feature of it is that we have the axon terminal, which is where the neurotransmitter is stored, and it's released across the synaptic cleft, which is a space, and attaches to receptors on the other side. That was basically what we saw with like skeletal muscle. Remember that with the motor end plates, the synaptic cleft, and then the secretion of acetylcholine. In the same lecture, we spoke about the other family of cells, the glial cells, of which there's a plethora of them. We've got several in the central, things like oligodendrocyte and dendrocytes and so on. And then, of course, in the peripheral nervous system, for example, Schwann cells. So you should know where they're found and what their role is. Related to the glial cells, of course, we spoke about the blood-brain barrier, the role of the astrocytes, but more detail about the structure of the blood-brain barrier. What is the purpose of it? What is it comprised of? Remember, we have these tight junctions of capillaries, which prevents a lot of large molecules from going back and forth between the brain and the blood vessel. And then we've got the astrocytes around them. So that's the general information. Then we looked at the brain, which is kind of an abbreviated view of the brain. Obviously, we were kind of in a time dependent situation. So I tried to cover as much as possible. And what we focused on primarily was the different regions of the brain. So we spoke about the telencephalon with its different lobes. And you should know where the lobes are found and what their general functions are. For example, the occipital lobe is the visual cortex, and so on. We started discussing different terms related to the cerebrum or the telencephalon. Remember the terms gyrus, which refers to kind of like the peaks or the folds, and then the valleys, which would be the sulcus. And of course, the more folds you have, it basically creates more surface area, which explains why mammals, especially humans and primates, have the more folds than most other animals. Other aspects of the brain, remember the brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. Remember we spoke about the white matter consisting as fiber tracts in the cerebrum. We spoke about projection fibers, association fibers, etc., that they're involved in. Like they're basically like cables communicating information from one region to the other, one lobe to the other, or within the same lobe, or to a different part of the brain. One of the lobes, of course, we spoke about was the frontal lobe. Two of them, actually, the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Remember, this is where we find a couple structures known as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And we spoke about, I showed those videos. Hopefully, I don't know if you saw them or not. Hopefully, I mean, I messed that up. But anyway, you saw the information. Broca's aphasia has to do with a impairment of Broca's area, which affects the ability to speak, to articulate, whereas Wernicke's aphasia is damage to Wernicke's area, which affects the ability to understand or comprehend. From the telencephalon, we went to the diencephalon, which consists of the pineal gland, which is involved in circadian rhythms. The thalamus, which remember is the sensory relay center before information reaches the parietal lobe or the sensory cortex. And of course, the hypothalamus. The mesencephalon or the midbrain consists of the peduncles, which are descending tracts of the spinal, of the fibers, basically axons that basically, we spoke a little bit later when we're talking about the spinal cord, about, as you'll see in the video, about ascending and descending tracts. The descending tracts are clustered into these peduncles in the brain, and they carry information from the brain down to the spinal cord. The other part of the mesencephalon is the corpora quadrigemina, which is divided up into the superior and inferior colliculi, which are involved in reflexes in response to visual stimulus and auditory stimulus, which results in our involuntary turning of the head. So superior colliculi is involved in visual reflexes. So if you see something off to the left, you turn your head that way. If you hear something to the right, your inferior colliculi will trigger you to turn your head to the right. Finally, we have the rhombencephalon, or the hindbrain, which consists of the cerebrum, motor coordination, right? Remember the pons, we spoke about respiratory regulation, kind of fine-tuning the main respiratory organ, which is the respiratory control, which is the medulla oblongata, which controls not only breathing, but regulates heart function and some of the visceral functions such as sneezing, coughing, vomiting. Next, we have the limbic system, which is actually a collection of structures from different parts of the brain. Should know what the limbic system is involved with. Remember, this is a region that processes emotions into memory. So we spoke about the different structures that are part of that. If you think about it, what are the things you remember most are the things that had some sort of emotional impact on you. And also smell, right? Smell is something that we have a certain smell that we may have remembered from a long time ago. And we also spoke about those membranes or meninges that surround the brain, the three meninges, the dura, arachnoid, and the pia. Finally, not finally, but next is the spinal cord. We spoke about the anatomy of the spinal cord, both the longitudinal arrangement, meaning the cervical, the thoracic, lumbar, sacral divisions. We spoke about that there are 31 divisions based upon the spinal nerves, correct? And we also spoke about kind of the different enlargements. There are certain enlargements in specific areas, namely the cervical and the lumbar enlargements. And we spoke about things like the conus medullaris and the cauda equina. Should know what those are. We also looked at the anatomy in a transverse cut, right, where you could actually see the neurons, the sensory neurons coming in through the dorsal root, the motor neurons leaving through the ventral root, but actually within the spinal cord itself, know what the horns correspond to. Remember, the dorsal horn refers to where the sensory neurons come into the spinal cord. The motor neurons leave through the ventral root, or the ventral horn. We also spoke about what the columns are, and which, remember, are the myelinated fibers that comprise the ascending and descending nerve tracts. We also spoke about spinal meninges. In reference to the spinal nerves, so remember, besides the spinal cord, we also have nerves that are going to and from the spinal cord, much like we also have nerves that are going to and from the brain. We talked about how the spinal nerves are organized into mostly plexuses. There's 4 of them. You should know the nerves that are part of each plexus. For example, the cervical plexus has the phrenic nerve, right? And then there's areas of where you don't have any plexuses. It's just spinal nerves. Remember, in the thoracic area, which are the nerves that innervate, the intercostal nerves, which supply the intercostal muscles between the ribs. We spoke about the ascending and descending nerve tracts, the names of them, whether they're ascending or descending, and general functions. And then finally, we ended up talking about cranial nerve, which probably could have been in the cranial lecture, but as long as we're talking about spinal nerves, you should know the numbers and the names of the cranial nerves. So in other words, if cranial nerve 1, you need to know that it's also the olfactory nerve, that it's also sensory, and the fact that it's involved in bringing the sense of smell or smell stimulus into the brain. Finally, but not any less important, is the autonomic nervous system. I started off with kind of a comparison of the somatic pathway versus the autonomic pathway in terms of the nerves. Remember, in one case with somatic, you've got a single neuron that leaves the spinal cord or the brain that travels to the muscle. Whereas with the ANS, you've got a dual neurons. You've got preganglionic and postganglionic. We discussed the organization of the ANS. Remember, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, efferent fibers. We discussed the fact that most organs receive a dual innervation in the sense that they have neurons from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems, and that they typically have opposing effects. The one exception is a couple organs, primarily the blood vessels, and sweat glands are only supplied by the sympathetic system. So they have a sole innervation, whereas everything else is dual, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. We did a lot of comparing between the sympathetic and parasympathetic as far as where the nerves originate from. Remember, are they in the thoracic lumbar T1 to L2 area, or are they in the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and the sacral nerves? So the location and the features of them. As far as primarily the size of the neurons, pre versus post, and the nature of the neurotransmitter. As you know, with biology, there's always some exceptions. I mentioned that the adrenal medulla is an exception in the sympathetic system in the sense that instead of receiving, instead of being stimulated by a postganglionic nerve, the preganglionic neuron in this case is very long and directly stimulates the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, which respond by producing norepinephrine and epinephrine. We spoke about clinical conditions, or in some cases, clinical responses. We spoke about a adrenal gland tumor, adrenal medulla tumor, what are the features of it? And of course, we spoke about the response to anaphylactic shock, the role of sympathetic stimulation or treatment, like an EpiPen, why that works. We then went into sort of like the holy grail, the general functions of both branches, kind of do a compare and contrast, which organs they affect and how they affect them. And finally, we ended up with going over one example of the response to high blood pressure, which would be a response that would involve the parasympathetic system that responds to the high blood pressure by secreting, of course, acetylcholine to lower blood pressure. And this is sensed through baroreceptors. These are specialized cells in the arteries that detect blood pressure changes. And this will send a signal to the brain, which will then activate, in this case, the parasympathetic pathway. This last topic right here, the distribution of receptors, I've decided to omit that. We covered that quite extensively in physiology. All right, so let's go back. So that's the end of the review. So the exam will be on Monday. If you're in the morning group, it's at 8. If you're in the afternoon group, it's at 12:45. And you'll have a couple hours to complete the exam. And that's pretty much it. I may send out a, yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I think that's about it. So anyway, and I'll send this video to you guys. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye. Pause, stop.